Good evening. I'm the Reverend Rebecca Troutman, one of the clergy who has the pleasure and privilege of serving here at St. Aidan's for the few of you that I have not met before. It is my gift to welcome you here this evening to St. Aidan's and to the opening fall event for the Center for Spiritual Deepening. Mr. Russ Bradley will be introducing Dr. James Farwell a bit more in a minute, as will Dr. Farwell. But I would like to warmly welcome him because I have personal history with Dr. Farwell. He was my advisor during what is affectionately referred to, nothing but affection, Dr. Farwell, as Zoominary, when I completed the Diploma of Anglican Studies at Virginia Seminary during COVID. A lot of that was on Zoom. And so Dr. Farwell was my advisor, the cohort leader for the Diploma of Anglican Studies cohort, that group in that year, and then also the professor of liturgics. And so it's a true privilege to welcome him back here, back to our campus these many years later. So with that, I'd like to turn over to Russ Bradley, who can explain a bit more about tonight's discussion and how we came to invite Dr. Farwell onto campus.
Good evening. First, a little bit about the center. We have a retreat coming up in October, on October 24th and 25th, regarding Sufism. And it'll be led by Lynn Bauman, who has spent time in Iran. And so that should be a good program. One of the great things about the Episcopal Church is it shares a common prayer and not a common doctrine. And that frees us up to be a little more expansive in our approach to our faith and our practice. In my life, I've gotten a lot of traction with Buddhism. And over the years, just as Rebecca said, several seminarians have mentioned to me, you know, there's a professor at the seminary who has taken refuge. And finally, this summer, I was introduced, I guess it was actually this spring, our seminarian, Daniel Collier, introduced me to Dr. Farwell. And so, needless to say, it's a great validation to find that a professor of theology and liturgy is exploring down the same avenues as you, and in fact, he's 13 years ahead of me. He took the precepts 13 years ago, and I'm going to be taking the precepts in 6 weeks. So Dr. Farwell is going to tell his story about his encounters with Buddhism and how it's enriched his faith and his career as a seminary professor. So with that, welcome Dr. James Farwell. Thank you.
Okay, are we on? You said I didn't have to say that, but I thought I'd say it anyway because everybody does that, right? Are we on? Hello, can you hear me? All right. Good evening, everyone. It is nice to be with you. I was just telling Rebecca that because of my position, actually, I'm professor of theology and liturgy at Virginia Theological Seminary, duly appointed as the Boone Porter Professor of Liturgics at the General Theological Seminary in New York City. From all of that, you can deduce correctly that most of the time when I go out and speak places, I'm speaking about liturgy, about sacraments, about the prayer book, about baptismal formation, about liturgical renewal in the Episcopal Church, all of those kind of topics. I don't speak as much about this. I tend to write about it more than I speak about it. But what I want to do tonight is, indeed, as Russ said, tell you my story. Along the way and in and through the threads of my story, I'll make some observations about what Buddhist practice has done for me as an Episcopalian, as a baptized Christian, as a priest. And also along the way, sort of make a few observations. I'll try not to get too academic, but make a few observations about some issues in the theory of religions. Look at that, everybody's eyes just shaded over when I said that. theories of religion. So I'm not going to tell you about the theories, but behind some remarks I'm going to make about the challenges of dual practice are, let us say, vigorous debates that have been underway certainly since the 1990s in the academy about the nature of religions, what they are, how we've come to understand them and categorize them, which impinge directly on decisions that persons like me make on whether it is legitimate, authentic, defensible to be involved in more than one practice at the same time. That said, whatever I have to say about that doesn't mean I have the last word, and there are people, including some of my very own colleagues at VTS, who are not quite sure what to do with this thing, this Christian Buddhist thing that I do, and others who have been very welcoming of it and interested in learning from it. And so that's what I will do. Also, can I get a glass of water or something? I just tend to get dry after I talk for a while. Thank you. So let's just be clear about a couple of things at the outset. I am a Christian, baptized at, 3 months or something, confirmed in 1972, ordained a priest in 1989. I am still a Christian. I am still an unabashed, if poor, follower of Jesus. And my involvement in and with another religious practice has not altered that. That's not true. It has not relativized the importance of my discipleship of Jesus in any way, though it certainly has changed and altered it in some ways that I'll talk about tonight. Just to say a bit about my practice, so that once I get going with my story, I'll sort of count on you to remember what I've said about what it means to say that I'm Christian and Buddhist. I'll tell you how I had this encounter initially with Soto Zen Buddhism, but my practice is largely, thank you, that's perfect, is largely in sitting Zazen in the Soto tradition, which is one of two major Zen traditions founded in Japan. Soto Zen in particular is traced back to Dogen, a figure who lived from 1200 to 1253, who started in practices of esoteric Buddhism. That is to say, for our purposes here, Buddhism that emphasized ritual and chanting a great deal, and eventually moved into a setting where those things were not eliminated, contrary to popular belief, but in which the core of practice for Dogen is Zazen, is the particular practice of sitting meditation. That said, I have spent some time working with Tibetan Vajrayana visualization practices a little bit, Vajraguru practices, but that's not really my natural home. My natural home is Soto Zen. So what that means, as I stand here before you as a dual practitioner, all of that, is that I'm at the Eucharist every day at Virginia Seminary, and at the Eucharist with my wife at All Saints Sharon Chapel every Sunday, unless I'm off somewhere teaching someplace. I am ministering, teaching, liturgics, teaching Christian theology at the seminary, and I sit daily in Zazen, study the Buddhist sutras, not restricted to the Soto tradition, but much more broadly in the Mahayana tradition of Buddhism. So those two things sort of lie along, my wife suggested maybe the image is the two rails of a train track is what I move down, at least currently. But even a simple metaphor like that can be misleading, or certainly interrogated, and so I'll raise some of those issues a little bit tonight. What I like to say when I am talking about this is that I'm here because it was a particular Japanese practice of non-dual meditation. That's Zazen. There's lots of different forms, and there's lots of different kinds of non-dualism that are beyond what we'll do tonight. It was a particular Japanese practice of non-dualist meditation adopted and developed from a Chinese practice, which was adopted and developed from an Indian practice that changed my relationship to my own Christian practice, which is why I'm here today. Now, in another setting, in another topic, we could talk about the way in which all religions actually are interreligious. They are all feeding into and flowing from one another in various ways, not universally, but in certain kinds of clusters and histories and genealogies, but that's a much more academic topic that we'll do some other time. Let me just begin a bit with my story. Now, if I was going to start way back, but I don't have that kind of time tonight, I would start with a grandmother who largely raised me, who was very much out of step for her time and station and background and education, interreligiously curious. So being around her had an influence. That's an influence way back. Another older influence would be, during my teenage years, my journey through the charismatic movement as it hit in the Episcopal Church. I spent a number of years in the 70s and early 80s playing music for the charismatic movement for a particular charismatic parish in my hometown. A discovery of Thomas Merton, somebody I'm sure that's familiar to most of the people in this room, in about 1979, and then the discovery of Christian monasticism, particularly the Trappist order and the Roman Church, after which I discovered, despite having been Episcopalian all my life, that we too had religious orders. So that's a part of the deeper background sort of story that I could tell. And also, I'd be remiss if I didn't say a function of the influence of a lot of on-the-ground theologians, clergy in the, at that time, fairly moderate Diocese of Florida, where I was surrounded by clergy as chaplains in my high school and mentors in my ordination process and so forth, who were themselves deep theologians in practical contexts and had an enormous influence on my growth and my thinking. However, I'm going to start my story from closer in, although not very close, 1994, but very much the middle of my life, after I had been in Episcopal Church for 5 years, Episcopal Priest for 5 years, had served parishes for a while, went off to Emory University to do doctoral studies, to do a PhD, because I thought I wanted to teach. So various things were happening for me in 1994 that were the conditions for my encounter with Soto Zen Buddhism as a life-giving sort of encounter. One was an awareness that I was clinically depressed in a family that had a long history, has a long history of anxiety and mood disorders of various kinds, and was just coming to grips with the fact that I was struggling with that and what that meant for my life and so forth. An increasing awareness in the course of therapy, second condition that led to this, that very much a certain virtue that I picked up from the climate of my childhood was having a tremendous effect on the way that I was living my life at the time, and a not insignificant factor in my depression and working through depression. And that particular sort of way of inhabiting the world that I inherited, don't need to get into the who's and the what's and the where's, but that I inherited from earlier on in my life, is that life is always elsewhere. It starts tomorrow, or it's over here, or it's when X happens, or Y occurs, or when we just get past Z, that's when life begins. So it started out very much as a sort of waiting for tomorrow kind of way of inhabiting the world, and increasingly became, as I put it, a kind of way of living as if my life was elsewhere, or as my psychiatrist, God bless him, once put it, you're living as if you're not in your right life. So that was going on for me. And then on the academic side, there were other things as well, but on the academic side, I happened to be at that time in a doctoral seminar with one of my professors in the program there at Emory, and we were studying something that he called cross-cultural theology. If John were alive today, it would probably be referred to as comparative theology, which is more the going term, if you're at all familiar with that. But he called it cross-cultural theology. And John Fenton, who was himself an Episcopalian, a close friend of the Dalai Lamas, with whom Emory was beginning to establish the first of those relationships that the Dalai Lama has now established with several universities around the U.S., John's interest was always whether mysticism in this tradition over here and mysticism in that tradition over there were the same thing. Were they the same experience? Were mystics in this, that, and the other tradition all encountering at some level a kind of transcendent, beyond words, images, and symbols? Or were the mystics conditioned, prepared, and set up with the symbolic worlds they lived in, whether Christian or Buddhist or Hindu or Jain or Sikh or whatever, were they conditioned to have mystical experience that actually they weren't all the same? They were different kinds of encounters, even if they possessed some of the same qualities of mystical experience one has that are sort of beyond words, a kind of a moment of in-seeing into how things are, an immediacy of experience with the transcendent. That was sort of the issue that drove him. So we were reading with John in this doctoral course. I'm not even going to remember all of them, but everybody from Pseudo-Dionysius, the ancient Christian mystical theologian, negative theologian, to Meister Eckhart, to Thomas Aquinas, the great medieval theologian who still lies in many ways at the foundation of modern Roman Catholic theology. We were reading Shankara and Ramanuja, the Hindu Advaitist mystics, Advaita Vedantists. We were reading Dogen, which is where I first bumped into Dogen. And then we were reading into the modern period, into modern Christians, Buddhists, and to a lesser degree Jews and Hindus who were in dialogue with one another about whether what even in our symbol systems and theologies, using that term loosely, whether we might actually be talking about the same thing or something very different. So, for example, when a Buddhist was speaking of the nature of the self as empty, now that's an English translation of a, ultimately Sanskrit word, but it's good enough. The emptiness of the self, whether what Buddhists say about the self being empty of permanence was in any way at all like what Philippians 2:5 through 11 was referring to when saying that Christ, who though he was in the form of God, emptied himself, taking on the form of a servant. These were the kind of dialogues that were going on between early in the 20th century Japanese Kyoto school philosophers and Western philosophers, and then ultimately between Christian theologians and Buddhist theologians as well. So all this is going on. Dogen captured my imagination. Fascinating figure. Just read you a couple of things from Dogen here. Just understand that birth and death is itself nirvana. Everyone know this term, nirvana, that's used in Indian and post-Indian traditions, basically meaning the cessation of suffering. That's all it means in its most limited way. Just understand that birth and death, which they were busy in the Indian traditions trying to be released from because that's where they associated the suffering to be, just understand that birth and death is itself nirvana. There is nothing such as birth and death to be avoided. There is nothing such as nirvana to be sought. Only when you realize this are you free from birth and death. Do you see the playfulness and the paradox there? There's a sense in the moment that he's going to give away entirely the whole affair of the need to practice and to enter into a spiritual path. You don't really need to do that. That's all based on illusion. There's nowhere to go, nothing to attain. You're fine right where you are. And only when you realize that are you ready to enter the path and attain. Dogen's thought is often referred to as the pathless path. He is not the only Japanese Buddhist to speak in this way, but he is in many ways the most eloquent about what I like to call the absolutely essential and completely unnecessary nature of spiritual practice. Absolutely essential, completely unnecessary. Both at the same time. Listen to him again. The way is basically perfect and all-pervading. How could it be contingent on practice and realization? Indeed, the whole body is beyond the world's dust. He's referring there to an older Zen story about getting the mirror clean. And anyway, if you know that story, you know that's what he's referring to. Who could believe in a means to brush it clean? It is never apart from one, right where one is. What is the use of going off here and there to practice? This from Dogen, who started his life on Mount Hiei practicing in Tendai Buddhism, came down the mountain and joined Kenenji, another Buddhist temple, still there to this day. All of these are, though not the same buildings, right there in Kyoto. Ultimately became dissatisfied with that, traveled to practice in China, came back from China, established a temple just south of Kyoto. That lasted for a little while and for a variety of reasons. Then off he went up into Fukui province and established what is still today one of the two main teaching and practice temples of Soto Zen. What is the use of going off here and there to practice? He says. This guy says, what is going on there, right? So Dogen fascinated me, and it turned out that in Atlanta, there was a little Atlanta Soto Zen Center, except that I didn't know it was little at the time. I was in a very big church in Atlanta. Atlanta's a very big place. I thought, okay, the Soto Zen tradition, they're going to follow the teachings of Dogen, and I'm quite fascinated by this. And I'm already at that point in my academic career committed enough to the essential nature of liturgical practices to a particular religious tradition. So I said to myself, if you really want to know what this Dogen Zen thing is all about, while you're reading his texts in this graduate seminar, you ought to go down to the Atlanta Soto Zen Center and just sneak in the back and kind of be just an observer. Just ask if it would be okay if I'm just be there as a visitor. So I walk into the Atlanta Soto Zen Center. It's about the size of, there's nothing analogous here. It was not a whole lot larger than your sanctuary here, where the altar is. And there might have been 4 people practicing the day I arrived. And it was one of these places where, unlike your church and many of our lovely churches, you didn't walk in the door and have a kind of a gathering space where you could connect before you went. You opened the door and you were in the zendo. And I walk in, and there are these people getting ready to sit, and here is the Roshi, and I thought, oh my Lord, what do I do now? It seemed really a stretch to ask to sit with a total of 5 other people doing their practice and me sit in the corner. It didn't seem right, but I was also in the door at that point. So I made a split-second decision. Being an Episcopalian of relatively liberal mind and not imagining that God judges us for these kinds of things, I thought, well, okay, I'm just going to dive in. I'm going to sit. And the Roshi was very welcoming. And I came in and I got the brief instructions on how to do the sitting in the way that they do it in their Sangha, in their community. And I started sitting, and I haven't stopped. That was in 1994. And what happened for me, and of course this is to extend a much longer story that I'm only alluding to. It didn't all happen that first day I sat on the cushion at Atlanta Soto Zen Center. But what it spun into was a practice that was for me undeniably health-giving, life-giving. This was before I had any good way to think about how I could be doing that while being Christian, not to mention a priest in a Christian church. This was very early in our discussions, both scholarly and more popular, about what dual religious practice or belonging might be, or what we might make of the reality that there are, and have been for some time, as my friend, the scholar John Thetamanol puts it, we've long been in the phenomenon of Eucharist upstairs and yoga downstairs, right? There's plenty of folks, and I think I'm looking at some of them right here, who have engaged in the spiritual practices of other traditions than Christianity. And so we've had the phenomenon for a while, but there is a moment when somebody hit the gas on this about 25 years ago, and it started to be a much more kind of public phenomenon that scholars had to start making some sense of, and clergy in all traditions had to start making some sense of. So I stayed with that practice, and what that practice, really did for me, and I'll just sort of lay that out here, and then I'll return to the rest of the story and the questions that can be asked. But what that practice really did for me is, first of all, helped me to engage in this deeply malfunctioning way in which I was living a life that was never where I actually was. And the practice of Zazen in particular, just because of the nature of the practice. This is not to say Christianity doesn't have resources in this area, or that Christianity was not also of some help as I continued to practice my Christian faith, but Zazen in particular, as a practice that is pointless, was extremely helpful to bring me to myself, to bring me to the moment on the cushion, not going anywhere, not aspiring to do anything, not trying to accomplish something spiritually or theologically or sacramentally. As good as all of those things were in my home native tradition, it forced me to simply be where I was and not detach, but learn the skill of non-attachment to the various kinds of emotions and sentiments and sensibilities that were roiling my mind at that time and had me mightily struggling with this sort of clinical condition that, even if it hadn't been a clinical condition, it still would have been quite the existential condition to wrestle with. To that point, let me pause for a moment and quote one of my favorite quotes, and the whole essay is fabulous, but if I read the whole thing, it'd be 4 pages and we'd be here all night. So I'll just give you a little taste of it. This is a little piece from Norman Zuketsu Fisher, formerly a Jew who is now a well-known Buddhist teacher, and who was very involved in a series of talks between Eastern and Western monks that began back in the 1990s and kind of carried on and kind of tapered off around the early 20-teens, known as the Gethsemane Encounter. Some of you have probably run into it. There have been 4 books that sort of give you a kind of a cleaned up verbatim of the exchanges between these Eastern and Western monks. But at one of these gatherings, Fisher was asked to talk about Zazen, to help the, in this case, mostly Trappist monks at the Abbey of Gethsemane, where they were meeting, by the way, Thomas Merton's old monastery, trying to help them understand what Zazen was in relation to the kinds of things that the Trappist monks were doing, like centering prayer and Lectio Divina, all kinds of techniques that see some nodding heads that you have some familiarity with in the Christian tradition. Here's what Fisher had to say. Remember now, his Buddhist teacher, and you have to picture him, if it helps, in your mind, in full robes, teaching. And here's what he had to say about the practice of Zazen, which, by the way, I didn't say it, but simply means sitting meditation. Zazen is fundamentally a useless and pointless activity. A person is devoted to Zazen not because it helps anything, or is peaceful or interesting, or because the Buddha tells one to do it, though we may imagine that it helps or is peaceful or interesting or that the Buddha recommended it, but simply because one is devoted to it. Zazen for Zazen's sake. Everything that happens is already a manifestation of our original enlightenment, even though we simply do not notice it. We do not need to enter another condition or improve or disprove anything. And he goes on from there. You can see that how that kind of evaluation of what you're doing in Zazen would ring huge bells in the mind of someone who was trying to figure out that he was in fact living his right life, his only life. His life was not elsewhere. Well, so I stayed with Dogen Zen. It helped with that. Increasingly as a scholar, the more I practice the two, of course, the more I'm going to start working with the way dual practice works and what kind of things are moving across the boundary lines from the one tradition to the other, the one enriching the other, the one challenging the other. One of the things that has been most useful to me as a scholar theologically is the power of the Buddhist notion of non-attachment, even to the things of the Buddha, in helping us think about our roots in a monolatrous tradition, Judaism, for whom the first sin and the root of the problem is idolatry. Let me put it in Buddhist rather than Jewish or Christian terms. We make idols of things. We attach ourselves, is the Buddhist language, to one or another thing that we think will fortify and strengthen and protect and enrich the self that we are. And we need to go get those things. We worship them. We make idols of them. We go after them. Whatever they are for you, whatever they are for me, whatever they are for every human being, we can make an idol of anything. We also work very, very hard in the Buddhist prescription of things to avoid anything that we think is going to threaten us, make us vulnerable, make us painful, make us grieve. This is the pattern of attachment and aversion that the Buddha ultimately teaches against. And the Japanese make a special science of turning that virtue of non-attachment into a relentless anti-idolatrous campaign against anything that you can attach to, even the Buddha himself. Why do we think, even though most Americans who hear this probably don't have any idea what it means, why do we think that the Japanese Buddhists would teach, if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him? You've heard this koan before? If you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. What? My word, what is all? They're Buddhists. What in the world does this mean? Because in the Buddhist mind, if you have externalized that that is the Buddha and you're over here and you've got to get there and be that, you don't have a problem that you're not that. The problem is you think you have to be that to be okay. And what has to be unraveled is the whole pattern of attachment, even to the Buddha, right? Another one of my favorite Buddhist stories, and then I'll go back to a few concluding thoughts. Another Buddhist story of two monks, the old monk and the young monk, and they're all committed to the Vinaya. These are the monastic rules that are followed by Buddhist monks in their various orders, and the Vinaya are held to be very, very important. It's very much like a rule in Western monasticism, the kinds of things that good monks do and the kinds of things that good monks avoid, and all of that. So they're following the Vinaya, and these two monks, old and young, come down to a river together, and as they approach the river, now forgive the gender bias stuff in here, but it's an old story. They come down to a river, and there's a young woman standing at the edge of the river, and it's been raining heavily, and the river is swollen, and she cannot get across, and she needs to get across. And the monks walk down to her, and the older monk scoops her up in his arms, carries her across the river, and sets her down on the other side. And with the younger monk, goes on his way. It's quiet for a while, but you can tell that things are heating up with the younger monk. He's getting more and more annoyed, more and more agitated, more and more uncertain about what's just happened. And he finally explodes at the older monk and says, "That was against the Vinaya. We're not to have contact with females. Why did you do that? Why did you carry her across the river?" And the older monk looks at the younger monk and says, "I put her down back on the other side of the river. Are you still carrying her?" It's a story about non-attachment. It's about doing what's necessary to do before you, living in the life you live, take it as it comes, and continue. Not detaching. I say again, this is not detachment. This is not a withdrawal from the world, right? The old Buddhist saying, before enlightenment, what do? Chop wood and carry water. After enlightenment, what do? Chop wood, carry water. It's how you chop the wood and carry the water that Buddhism aims to change in you. To be non-attached, to inhabit one's life, to do what is called for, and to move forward. So this spoke to me. That's sort of a little bit of a side pass into some of the teachings of this tradition, not nearly as many as I would love to regale you with, but I'd have you for 3 hours. So I just want to say a little bit now about how this all progressed for me as a dual practitioner. And that'll bring us to a nice end where you all can do some breakout groups, and then we'll have some Q&A at the end. So here I am. I'm a Christian. I'm a priest in the Episcopal Church. I'm not even sure I really ought to talk about this very widely with people in the Episcopal Church, even though I was involved in a very, very liberal church. And as time would tell, people became very interested when they learned about it because they were also involved in such things, Eucharist upstairs, yoga downstairs, and they desperately wanted to talk to a priest, of all people, about whether they were going to hell for this or not, right? So it turned out people were quite curious. But I wasn't sure early on. I was pretty cagey about it early on. I wasn't secret about it, but I just didn't broadcast it. But here I am with these two traditions, and I got to figure out what to do with them. Can I be doing this? What am I doing? Have I got a foot in two different rivers? Here are the things I couldn't do. I could not pretend that one is a religion and one is not. Now, it turns out, and nobody loves Merton more than I. I've read his stuff from back to forward 17 times. I love him, very forward thinking for his generation, but wrong about Zen being a practice, not a religion, and therefore it's perfectly fine for you to do Zen and be a Christian because one is a religion, the other one's not. Wrong. That's wrong. If you've studied Buddhism at all, you know that you are dealing there with something that has all the trappings, characteristics, virtues, and nature of a religious tradition just like ours, including God and gods, although they don't understand the gods in the same way that we understand God. So I couldn't just say, I'm a Christian who happens to practice Zazen. That wasn't going to work for me. This is what being a scholar does, is you get forced to think through all this kind of stuff, and they take all the easy paths away for you. I would have liked that one. Zazen, it's just a practice. I'm just incorporating it into it. Can't do that. I also can't pretend that there are two different versions of the same thing. I am not, as we used to call it more often, a perennialist. I'm not someone who sort of imagines, there are other terms for it as well, but someone who imagines that all of the religious traditions of the world are basically about the same thing in different clothing. And the differences in clothing, the symbol systems, the language, the doctrine, the practices, is because of the cultural contexts in which people grew up. That wasn't going to work for me either, because I was too astutely aware of a couple of things. One is that there are real differences in the way the two traditions understand and practice. And secondly, they are, as religious traditions, comprehensive. Now, this one, if I was in a class teaching about this, is one I would get up on the desk and tap dance for a while and really spend some time on. Let me just hope I've emphasized it just by saying that. We need to remember when we're dealing with the phenomenon of dual practice that we are talking about two different traditions with comprehensive reach. By which I mean, they mean to explain everything. Their cosmology, their philosophy or theology, if you wish, depending on the religion, their epistemology, the way they understand how we know things, the practices that coordinate with that sort of thing, the anthropologies they hold, what's the nature of the self, and what does the self need to be doing to be getting more whole and better, is all tied to the metaphysics. It's all a systematic, comprehensive account. And there's not a religion in the world that presents itself as giving a non-comprehensive account of all of reality. That's exactly what a religion is. So there was that issue, which dialed up the heat for me as a dual practitioner. Why did I keep going then? Because it was life-giving. I could not deny that it was life-giving, that it was doing something for me, and that surely God, whatever else I was making of the fact that I was doing these kind of two, in some ways, contradictory things at the same time, God surely wanted me healthy and alive. And something was happening with me in my Buddhist practice that helped me come alive. And I had to just throw myself on that presumed mercy and keep going. I did, however, for a very long time, and I'm sort of bringing this part to a conclusion, for a very long time I did not officially become a Buddhist. Now, this itself is a little squishy because taking refuge as a Buddhist has a different history than, say, being baptized as a Christian in terms of the way it's been conceptualized. But be that as it may, that now, for better or for worse, as Russ is about to go do, is the way that you sort of formally profess yourself as a Buddhist. And I did not do that because it continued to feel like too much of a puzzle, even disingenuous in being a priest of one tradition, but practicing this other one. So I did not in any way officially affiliate with Buddhism in general or any particular Buddhist lineage or school. But this went on for a number of years. I was doing some research in Japan. I've been a couple of times, getting ready to go again next fall. And I reached the point where I began to realize that my capacity to practice well as a Christian, that my understanding of what was going on in the sacraments, that my steadiness as a practitioner in my home tradition was all being nurtured by my Buddhist practice. To the point, again, this is several years of development, where I started to feel that it was disingenuous not to take refuge as a Buddhist. I was denying something that was already, in fact, going on, and not only did not seem to be collapsing my Christian tradition, but in ways beyond what was explainable from a theoretical point of view, for all those reasons I just cited, that you can't just kind of stick these two together really easily. Despite all of that, I could not deny that my Buddhist practice was enriching my Christian practice. Now, I'll say a word about what my Christian practice does for my Buddhist practice at the very end. And so I did take refuge and continue to practice now in these two traditions. Here, as we come to conclusion, I will say a word or two about where I am now, because that was 13, 14 years ago when I took precepts, and I have continued to practice these two, to continued to sort of look at the ways in which my approach to something like the sacrament of the Eucharist is deepened and challenged and enriched by the way Buddhists understand the presence of the goal that you are aiming toward, in our case, the presence of Christ in the Eucharist. Stayed with that, and I ultimately have decided that I'm not a very good Christian. Who is? If you think you are, you're probably not. So we should all remember we're probably all really lousy at this. I'm probably not a very good Christian, but I'm a worse Buddhist. And the reason is that there are, at the end of the day, things as a Christian that I will not give up, and that I actually think cannot be given up without going beyond dual practice as a puzzle and a mystery, and dual practice ultimately becoming a radical self-contradiction. And I won't give you the whole list, but one of the things that I won't give up that makes me what one scholar, Fabian Fulker, calls an asymmetric non-dualist. That's a pretty good phrase for it, although I'm using it in my own way. I'm a bit of an asymmetric non-dualist. I am willing to concede that much of what we view as stable is not. That much of what we view is as permanent is not. That the nature of the self is such that it is just exactly what the Buddhists say. It is no self. It is anatman. It is shunyata. It's empty. That's not to say it doesn't exist. Americans had a bad track record early on of misunderstanding Buddhism that way as being kind of nihilist. It's not that we don't exist. Buddhism is addressing how do we exist. And to exist as empty is to exist as utterly dynamic, changing, and completely interdependent on all other utterly dynamic, changing things that we are related with. That's what the emptiness doctrines mean. I'm convinced of that. But for Buddhists, that doctrine goes, shall we put it, all the way down. It doesn't stop with the phenomenal world. It doesn't stop with the self. Even the gods are empty. Even the divinities in all Buddhist traditions are ultimately themselves empty. Even the great devas and gods who in both Hinduism and Buddhism eventually find themselves up to one of the higher heavens as a result of good karma and long practice over many lives, probably many eons. Ultimately, once that good karma is all worked out, they too will fall back into another form. There is nothing in Buddhism that is not ultimately empty. And I cannot go there with God. As a Christian, I remain convinced by faith and experience that underneath or within or surrounding all that is, however dynamic it is a divine ground. If you like Paul Tillich, 20th century theologian, you can think of this as being itself. God is not a being. God is being itself. And while that being is by no means static, and so the Buddhists can even help us tune up the way that we think about God as some sort of permanent, immovable kind of power, God is a power of living itself that is ever, always, fully himself, herself, without remainder or exhaustion, living and everlasting. And that is so fundamental to the Jewish and Christian and Muslim tradition, for that matter, that that's where I draw the line on Buddhist non-dualism. Now, as I alluded early on, and I promise I won't keep you here for this so you can breathe a big sigh of relief for it, there really are multiple forms of non-dualism in both what we now call Hinduism and Buddhist traditions. There's not just one thing, and it's something I do God forgive me, but that is something I hasten to point out to groups that I speak to these days, because at the moment there are a few writers, I'm not going to use their names since we're recording this, but I bet you can figure out who they are, who are like, they're the cottage industry of non-duality is where it's all at. And they actually have a rather poor understanding both of what Buddhists mean by non-dualism, which does not rule out duality or difference, and they seem unaware that there are across these Indian traditions and East Asian traditions a range of different ways of thinking about what it means to say the world is non-dual and therefore we are non-attached to it. And they argue about it with each other just as much as Presbyterians and Episcopalians and Roman Catholics argue about things as Christians, right? So just that little caveat. But whatever form of non-duality would ultimately be applied to the nature of the divine is not something my faith allows me to accept. But I have found my Buddhist practice deeply enriching in the way that I approach the sacraments, preach, inhabit my life, and join together with the resources of my Christian tradition. They have all helped me live better than I think I would have done with the one alone. So, I remain a lousy Christian and even worse Buddhist. I'm not going to take the non-duality all the way to the bottom. I remain committed as an asymmetric dualist to the irreducible being that is God, that is the commitment of all the monotheistic, monolatrist traditions. I don't think you can give that away without becoming something else entirely, which is also fine if that's what you want to do, but I cannot do that as someone who inhabits both of these traditions. I do take some comfort, and I'll conclude with this for now, from two things. One, Ruben Habito. Anybody read Ruben Habito's work? This group might have some film in. Nope. He is both Catholic and Zen Buddhist. Grew up in the Philippines, if I remember correctly. I think he even trained to be a Jesuit for a while. He is no longer a Catholic priest. He is married. He lives in the U.S. now, and he established it's not exactly a Christian Buddhist Zendo. It's just a Zendo, but it is called Maria Kanon Zendo in Texas. Kanon is the Japanese translation of Avalokiteshvara in the Indian tradition, which is basically the Buddha of compassion. So Maria, Mary, compassion, right? It's a Zendo. He's very well known, has written a great deal. Go look for his books, Habito. They're really quite provocative, and they might be helpful if you're interested in this topic at all. Ruben Habito. But Ruben retired recently, and at the American Academy of Religion, as we sent him off on his way, people said, as you would expect somebody would ask, so Ruben, what are you going to work on in your retirement? He was at a Southern Methodist, I believe, for very many years at SMU. So he retired from his position there. And he said, I'm going to continue to work on this koan that is my life. You know the concept of a koan in Buddhism. It's not just something irrational. Many of the koans make a great deal of sense. They're in story form. They're completely followable. But they are something that are meant to push you beyond your normal understanding of reality. And in one form of practice, not Soto Zen, but in another form of Zen, there's a whole study series of koans that you do, that you move through as a part of your Buddhist practice. Well, Ruben has come to a place where, as both Catholic and Buddhist, his life is to him a koan, a puzzle, not to be solved or answered, but to provoke you into a different way of seeing. And I took great comfort in that comment of Ruben's, because I'm very much living a koan. And the deeper I get into it, the more I'm able to say about it, but I get no closer ultimately to making sense of being rooted in both of these two comprehensive religious traditions that are up to different things in many ways. So I take some comfort there. And I do take some comfort, although it's a very Christian sort of account, but it's it's a comment of a Christian, of a Jew about her attraction to Christ, Simone Weil, who once said, Christ is himself truth. And so I'm paraphrasing here. If you've got to choose between Christ and truth, always choose truth. And now I'm quoting again, and you won't go far before you've fallen into Christ's arms. So I rely on the value of a koan and try to think of my life in this way as a koan that still has something to teach me. And I try to trust that Simone Weil was absolutely right and that my own experience is right, that even to practice in a tradition utterly unlike the one in which Jesus practiced and in which I am baptized and ordained, if it brings me life, God's got something going on with this, even if I don't quite have a good, clear, logical, systematic way of giving an account of that. All right, I'll leave it there for you for now. Thank you. You want to give some kind of instructions on breakout groups?
All will be well. I'm going to ask one question. We have recorded Dr. Farwell, which he graciously has allowed us to do because we like to share these lovely opportunities with other people who weren't able to be here tonight. Would people be comfortable having, and it will be audio only, would people be comfortable having the Q&A also be in that recording so that we can capture those responses? All right, so I'm going to hand this over to Ryan. Here's the one thing we ask of you when you ask a question. If you'll say it into the mic, it just makes sound better for everybody and it will make it better for the recording. So Ryan will bring you a mic if you have a question. He's barefoot, he can run back.
I'll start with a question.
As long as you have the mic.
So how far do you go in, I don't want to use the word joining, but in, I guess, crossing the streams of the true traditions? Do you go so far as to say, like, from the Buddhist side, Jesus is a bodhisattva, or how do you kind of weave that?
Yeah.
Or do we Ghostbusters it and not cross the streams?
My default is not to cross the two. My default there is out of I never really got into the theory of religion stuff, but among other things, it's a sort of a post-colonialist instinct to make sure that we are not appropriating one another's practices up and out of the contexts in which they make larger sense, because this one thing feels good or works good for us. So I try. That's my default position. Now, it is a fact, and I've already said it, that over the course of time, despite an attempt to really let the integrity of each tradition be what it was, and be practicing Buddhism when I was doing that, and be practicing Christianity when I was doing that, it has become obvious that the doing of the one has deepened and changed the doing of the other. But I still always maintain, even as I am making those connections, I try to be very careful about taking something over here and giving it a Christian version over here, because that sets it into a whole system that's not its natural home and probably immediately is going to distort it in some way. If I may, I'll tell you a quick story, and I'm not even sure I'm happy with this, so I probably shouldn't tell it, but I'm going to tell it anyway. For the longest time, where I practiced at home, I had a Christian shrine space, an icon of Jesus, the Sinai Christ, and various other icons. And in another space, I had an Amida Buddha that somebody gave me a long time ago. And that was the way I did that for years and years and years. Recently, I have changed my shrine space at home, and I have both the Sinai Christ and the Amida Buddha on the same axis in front of me, both when I do zazen and when I do daily office. But I do not understand myself to be doing some kind of Buddhist version of daily office, and I don't understand myself to be doing something like morning prayer when I'm doing zazen, right? So, and what that recent decision has made, and I'm not sure I'm going to leave it that way, but what that recent decision signifies for me is this growing awareness that while I do not mix and match, I do, as John Donne used to call it, sort of in crossing over and returning, learn things in the crossover, not head stuff, though some of that too, that comes back with me to the other tradition as well. So it has come to be I've come to be not quite so allergic to having both of the visual cues, the visual figures there in the same place. But in 5 years, you should ask me that question, and I may have gone back to the other practice again. I don't know. So it's a great question.
The other apology is that this is a question that is born out of ignorance, so please don't, if it exposes something that you're going to say, well, that guy's totally ignorant. Well, yes. The answer is yes. So what you just said struck me as something that I don't know how to conceive of, which is when you talk about pure Christianity and pure Buddhism. But Christianity feels to me, right, someone who's not a scholar, it's already inherently an amalgamation of a number of different religions.
Correct.
It has, for better or worse, brought into itself. So the question kind of isn't that an inherent strength of Christianity, that it can bring in other concepts and blend them in? Or is it an inherent vulnerability or weakness of the faith?
Yes.
And is there, without the cultural appropriation, is there a way to blend those two in a respectful way? So that's a kind of a bundle of questions.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. But that was a really non-ignorant question from somebody who claimed to be ignorant. Well, this touches the part that, just did ultimately feel like I don't need to get that into this particular talk. But look, so let me riff a little bit on your comment. So yes, that is true of Christianity. It's also true of every other religious tradition. That's not unique to us. So one of the ways in which we have been hampered a little bit in the ways that we've thought about religion is that's a very late breaking concept for these traditions that we give various names to over time. It's really, we've really been only calling these religions and meaning what we mean by that for a little over 200 years. And it's very much a product of the Western mindset, the desire to organize knowledge encyclopedically, very much arises out of enlightenment, rationality, and many things that go along with that you totally don't want me to start talking about tonight. But what you end up with is this idea that there's this box of things called religion. And in that box, there's Buddhism and Christianity and Sikhism and Jainism, and some of them are dead. So they were in history, but we don't see them around anymore exactly. There are some positives to that way of thinking about this, in that I am being careful not to say, I want to be careful not to say that just anything of any tradition can be combined with any other. And that box paradigm, though it's being just almost universally criticized at this point, for good reason in the academy, does nevertheless recognize what I tried to say earlier on, that these traditions are comprehensive. And they are meant, even where they're borrowing from another tradition, they are using that and the things that they generate out of their own histories and other cultural streams they borrowed from, attempting to give a comprehensive account of reality that is realized through practitioners by the rituals and practices that they do. So that's the advantage to that. However, it is also true that that understanding of religion we got from the Enlightenment doesn't acknowledge very well that these systems, if you want to call it that, or cultural traditions, they're all permeable. And they're all always learning, borrowing from, and lending to one another. There's no religion in the world. I think, did I just say this, or was this somewhere else? I said this earlier this week. I think I said it here and said I wouldn't get into it, but all religions are interreligious. Yes. So that complicates the issue of dual practice. Because if you run with that, or you just say, oh, well, basically they're all just borrowing from each other all the time anyway, so I'll take a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of the other thing. Next thing you know, the person who's in the driver's seat is you. When what these traditions are asking you to do is rethink what you are, to let go of you, and to consent to be formed in some way by the tradition. So you have to be careful with this newer acknowledgement that religions are always very much in contestation with one another, borrowing and learning and sharing and building on certain things and rejecting certain other things. You don't want that to become a platform for what I'd be inclined to call cafeteria spirituality. Well, I just take a little of this and a little of that, whatever sort of suits me. But each one of these traditions, as permeably as they are related to one another, do each one, I want to argue, come to something overall, such that what Buddhism is about at the end of the day is not what Christianity is about, which, even though close cousins to Judaism, is not what Judaism is about, and on and on. So you're absolutely right that there's borrowing and lending and sharing going on all the time. It's important we recognize that. It helps us understand this kind of dual or even multiple practice that some people get into. If they're doing it sort of authentically and giving themselves over to be reshaped by those things. But at the same time, I want to honor the irreducible difference of the most basic metaphysical and spiritual commitments that each of the traditions comes to as a overused metaphor, but it's probably good here, as a whole greater than the sum of the parts, which is actually different than the other wholes that you might compare it to, even though they borrow. So it's a bit of a tightrope we're walking here. And in the academy, as far as theorists of religion goes, not my primary area, but I do work in it some, and I'm very much not in the old school. I want us to outgrow this kind of enlightenment idea that we had. But I also want to be fairly careful, and have written about this, about imagining the permeability of these things are so free that it really is mostly just about what the individual puts together that works for them spiritually. And then I think suddenly we turn around once and we realized we're just into the old Western individualist, I do my thing, you do yours. There are no real demands that come from these things. And that's a slippery road to get on. That is way more than you asked. But I am an academic, so I will always tell you way more than you asked. That's how we do this. Other questions? I'm also happy to just hear comments if you have something you want. It doesn't have to be a question to me. If you've got something you want to say or share with the group as a result of either something I said or your small group exchange, we're happy to hear that too.
It seems to me in some way you sort of have, by having the different faith traditions, you have given yourself over. You're not in control. You've given yourself over to the experience that you've had with these different traditions. And I think that is a way to, for me, it's a way to see the face of God. Mm-hmm. Even though I'm going to be rooted in this tradition. Mm-hmm. But there's going to be, many. But so I like the way you put those two together.
I appreciate that. And I would hasten to say that I will make that a process. I am giving myself over to something, or working on giving. It's right. I'm as cussedly individualistic as the rest of us at the end of the day. But it does seem to me that the process of spiritual formation is, in one way or another, undoing where you are and allowing a wisdom tradition, whichever one or many you're talking about, to bring those things to question, to unravel them in some sense, such that you can see anew. And of course, the mystical sub-traditions in all these traditions do indeed suggest, if you're going to see the face of God, all the rest of that stuff's got to go, including the notion that God has a face, or what that face is going to be, right? Which actually takes me back again to how helpful Buddhism is in its just radical anti-idolatry. We have our folks in the Christian tradition who can do that. John of the Cross is probably the chief among those who gets that everything must be stripped away, including the desire to see God. That too has to go, which just seems like a bridge too far for most Westerners, and the Buddhists push it even farther, right? So yeah, I think I'm what is it? Emily Dickinson says, what was it she said, one of her writings, I'm out with lanterns looking for myself. I'm most days more of a Bob Dylan guy who has that song where he says, I'm trying to get as far away from myself as I can. But there are days when I'm probably also out with lanterns, you know. And of course, to be too dyadic about that, you know, ultimately someone like Merton was really eloquent that to give away all that stuff that allows you to consent to the truly real ultimately is to find the true self. And recent scholars of Merton have made a lot more of that in his writing than some earlier writings did. So anyway.
So this really will be an ignorant question. But how important is self? I understand how important it would be to my spiritual journey. But in the scheme of things, aren't we all trying to get to where God lives, regardless of who we are or what's going on in our lives at that moment?
Well, the religious traditions all think the answer to that is yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And it's not, I'm still waiting for an ignorant question. I haven't gotten one yet. The religious traditions all certainly think that. They understand it in very different terms. You know, you almost have to lapse in as dry as it is in order to step back from the specifics of any particular tradition and biasing the way you talk about it in that way. You almost have to lapse into some of the language that comes from the scholarly study of religions and theory of religions and so forth. And even then, it's very hard to get away with, right? Theorists of religions for decades have been talking about the desire in all traditions, no matter what it's named and no matter what the practice is that gets you there and so forth. We're all seeking the transcendent. Okay, well, kind of, except immediately when you talk about transcendent and immanent, you're now in the orbit of the Abrahamic traditions. So what term do you use? Okay, well, some have said, we're all trying to figure out what's really real, get access to the truly real, right? But even that is heavily Western influenced, as most of the study of religions has been, because if you go over and ask the Mahayana Buddhist about how it is they understand getting to the truly real, if it's a teacher in a Japanese, temple, he's going to whack you up the side of the head with a stick. If it's if it's somebody who's not going to do that to you, they're going to say, what real, right? And they're going to deconstruct that as well. So it is very, very difficult to find unbiased language to articulate what you said, but I do not think that makes it wrong. And the other way to handle it is just to learn all of the religious traditions so well, or at least well enough, that you can use lots of the languages that are used from the traditions and be kind of even-handed about it. And that's the other way to sort of handle it. But that's, yeah, I think that's right. If it's not right, then this doesn't mean anything. None of it, right? I mean, if your query about is this not what ultimately all these traditions and all of we are looking for, then you're in nihilism. Then you're in absolute meaninglessness, and you can be here or you can go as you see fit, and there's no measure around that. So, yeah.
I would guess it's a lot easier to do dual practice as a Mahayana Buddhist rather than a Theravada Buddhist.
Yeah, so I'm gonna give the really basic answer to that, and then I'm gonna say but. The basic answer is Theravada Buddhism, which is a term we use in order not to use the pejorative term that Mahayanists used to use. They are more monastically centered. There is more of a kind of dualism at work in the way that they relate to the Buddha image and the Buddha concept. That's the basic answer. But one of the more interesting things that scholars of Buddhism have been discovering in recent years is that there are, if you put the right pair of glasses on, a number of Zen-like elements at work in a number of the Theravada schools that have grown up over the years. There's even a new book out. I think I have this title right. We're being recorded, so I hate it if it's wrong, but I think the book I'm thinking of is actually called Theravada Zen. And so you got to be careful even with these school differences, right? I mean, you and I were talking a little bit about this when we were talking the other day. Vajrayana, the Tibetans, they do all the visualizations and the practices and with the guru, and the ritual is important. And I'm just a Zen guy. That doesn't matter. If you go to any Zen temple in Japan, you're going to be surrounded by ritual and candles and incense lighting, chanting, sutras, the gathas, the whole thing, right? So even in Japan, where for a variety of cultural reasons, the schools are very insistent about which one you're in. Well, I'm a Rinzai Buddhist. We do the koan thing. I'm a Soto Zen Buddhist, do it with shikantaza, right? Just sitting. But you go into one of these, any one of these communities, and they're all doing the same thing. And as soon as you walk in, you're also going to pass under the Shinto torii gates as you're heading into the temple, right? So, yes and no is the answer. I mean, certainly Mahayana provides a kind of radical emptying of emptying, is what the texts often call it, that goes beyond just the emptiness of the self in Theravada. But when you begin to scratch the surface in Theravada, you start to realize there's more going on there. And there are plenty of schools within Mahayana Buddhism, not the Madhyamaka school, that actually have something going on that ends up feeling like a whole lot more like something permanent is underneath that all of these impermanent things are woven out of. So like Christianity and every other religion, we would be better, though we'll never get used to doing it, to refer to these things as Christianities, Buddhisms, Judaisms, Hinduisms. They're not monolithic. None of them are any more monolithic than we are. So, yes, and it's complicated.
pressing question that cannot wait. And maybe in the interest of leaving you wanting more, I've already kind of hinted at the fact that I see all the times we need to have Dr. Farwell come back, don't you think? Yeah. We scratched the surface of something that could go much further. So thank you for being with us. Thank you, Russ, for inspiration and for making things happen, and Brian for making technology happen. Thank you, everybody, for being here. We hope we'll see you in October. Come and do a retreat with us. And poke us and say, when is Dr. Farwell coming back? And then we'll try and make it happen.
Thank you all.
Thank you.